Why, hello everyone. So, I just wanted to update everyone on my devlog. It's been quite the frustration up to get to this point, but I feel really good about what I've learned, and I hope to share it with you guys. So, my overall goal for this milestone was just to set up if you're familiar with a multi-user dungeon or a MUD, back in the 90s or 80s, we used to have these small niche games that people could log into, and you would type slash look to look at the environment, and go slash north to go north, or slash south to go south. It was riveting. But I really did enjoy those games for various reasons, and one thing I wanted to pull into this game that I'm making is kind of a modern look at that old system and see how we can make that, interesting, and if I like it or not, we might keep it, right? So I started with this 2D layout. I thought, okay, you're gonna have a grid, you're gonna have each tile be like a part of the world that the player can move into, and this yellow dot's the player, right? So you would go north, and this is my animation for north, right? So I set up a keyframe for this whole grid, and this whole grid is actually consistent of a bunch of different, not different, but much of the same map cell blueprint that I made as well. And I believe it attempts to listen to events that are triggered by the player and then updates the cell grid animation and plays. I found that this worked okay. I had a hard time trying to resolve how to reset the map and update the data within it. And I also got really frustrated with the case where whenever I update the map cell, which contains many connections, for instance, it might or might not update the cells in the greater component here. And so I just ran into a lot of frustrations there. But aside from that, I do want to convey right now that if you know CSS really well in the web development world, you might actually get by pretty well by making 2D UIs in Unreal, because this grid panel is essentially the grid CSS layout mode, but implemented in UE. So for instance, this grid panel just holds a bunch of elements, and then I've just defined here a bunch of fill rules. So I've broke it down into a bunch of different values based off of a bunch of things that I actually drew up a whole thing in Photoshop and laid out the grid, and I set that up so that things could lay just so. And then they would all lay out just perfectly when I told them what row and what spans to take up. So working in this way was actually really nice. It's just when it came to actually getting more logic in and making it work, that was the problem. So I eventually just kind of gave up on that, and I thought, maybe what if this UE is just better suited for 3D, and maybe if I just made this a 3D tile-based system, would that actually be a better experience, right? So I went into that. This is the example of me using the 2D UI. This is similar to what you might see in a MUD interface, where you have like characters in their panels, maybe enemies in this panel. And I was thinking this would be here. Maybe the background would have like an image of what the environment looks like. Maybe there's some text here just describing that whole thing. So that was my thought. So this was my main idea. So moving on from there, I thought, okay, I'll just go ahead and rebuild this cell, but in widget form, in 3D form. And here you can see the tile that the user will sit on when they reach it. The north, south, east, west, and then north, south, east, west diagonals. I thought, okay, I was pretty happy with this. One thing to note is that I did run into a lot of scene update issues as well here, but I found that if I switch things to static structure, mobility, it's tended to update more regularly in the scene. So that's a tip, a good hot tip. And then I also set up a grid here. One thing I did notice is that I tried to animate things with sequencer to animate this grid, and it does work, but it doesn't have to. So like for instance, I probably disconnected at this point because I didn't need to use it anymore. So basically it works the same way. You pick an object that you add to the track, and then you can just lerp or just choose keyframes for how you want certain values to change over time, and it'll just play throughout this sequence. What I found is that that's more useful for more cinematic things. In this game I could have used that because it's a lot more static and there's no like physics or anything like that, so I could have gotten away with it, but it was much easier doing it this way that I ended up landing on. Oh, and before I get into that, I want to point out these enums and objects and structs. The reason why I have these is because I was having a hard time structuring in my mind or on paper how different objects would interact with each other and what the types would, how they would work like. So for instance, I knew that I have a set of directions that I want each player to be able to go, you know, north, south, east, west, diagonals, and up and down. So I figured, like, why not just make that in the numerator? Maybe I'll use that later. And then I moved on to say, you know, establishing what a cell is in class. I just set up a blueprint that's based off of the base object in UE. It's not an actor, it doesn't get added to a scene. And all it has is a cell to describe what it is. And then the cell is based off of struct cell. And I define struct cell here, which has a name, description, the cell connections involved, which is just an array of cell connections. I just wanted to convey that, like, building these structures ahead of time just to kind of flesh out what you're trying to do is also pretty helpful, because what I found is that eventually I started using them in my later implementations, even though they weren't like the intended use case at the time. They're actually pretty flexible once you lay those out. So if we go over here to the map cell grid and look at the viewport, so I took a bunch of these cells, like instances of these cells, added them as child widgets, and then arranged them in the grid like I would like. And this provided, my initial thought was, this would be where the player can move back and forth, and that would update the cells according to their location in the world. That was my initial thought. And I also set up some level sequences to move the map around. Of course, I don't need these anymore because I came up with a much more robust way of doing things. So that's where we get to this. This right here is the player pawn. It's just a sphere. I figured I would make this like some kind of nice icon with a portrait and maybe a nice way to see your various stats like on the fly. But for now, it's just got a camera and it's got a sphere. And then it also has these interesting little directions, north, south, east, west. And I'll explain what those are for in a minute. So what happens is the player gets spawned in the world. And by the way, I just overrode like the third person player perspective thing by going into the settings and updating the game mode, I believe, or level mode. There's a configuration here. I forget what it is at the moment, but you can change what the controller is being used, what class. They give you like example classes and an example controller for what spawns when the game starts. You can override that and make that whatever you want. Here I've made a player controller. All it does is says begin play. There's nothing additional happening there. It's just nothing crazy just yet there. And over here, the pawn is used by the controller to spawn the pawn into the world. So that's what happens here. So I let this be the place where I start. And as you can see, these arrows have relevance because they're pointing to the next cell. Now why would I do it like that? Some of you might already know, but I'll get to that. So the next thing I wanted to do is, now that I have this grid and I have this cell, I also have this nice light that kind of like conveys that, hey, you can't see all the way across the world, right? You can just only see a certain distance. I went into the event graph and started working out how to establish moving the player where it needs to go. So on the begin play, what I do is I do a print string just to make sure this is getting hit. And this is getting hit because the controller is calling is creating this pawn at the beginning of the play, and then it's listening to events, so that's why this is working. I grab the default scene root, I get the world location and its forward vector. I extend that vector by 10,000, arbitrary number. I add it to the world location, so it's actually at the point where we're expecting it to be. Then we start up a line trace by channel. A line trace is like a raycast. So the start position is where the scene root currently is. The end position is where the forward vector is. Now, the forward vector is always on the x-axis in Unreal. So this red one is always a forward vector. So it's going to raycast from here all the way to the cell, and it's going to return what it hit. So once it does that, make sure it's on the visibility channel. There's also, you can make custom channels apparently. I didn't need to do that in this case. You can also establish like visual helpers, so you can say, hey, the trace color is going to be red, and if it hit, it turns green. How long do you want it to go? In this case, I didn't need to actually see it because I just wanted to see it change. And then what we do is we take the actor class that they pass and upgrade it to a actor map cell, which is this cell we've created here. So with that, I can then use that, store it as the chosen cell. The chosen cell gets stored here, and then what we do is we grab the scene root as the target for set world location, and this will move it to where we need to. So we get the chosen cell, which is where it's starting at begin play, and it's just defaulting it to the -230 position that it currently is at. And I just wanted to do that to make sure it's all consistent when you start and when you move. Like, I don't want you like starting higher and then moving down to another location. Just start where you are. Now, I took this and I extrapolated it to an animation. And the reason why it's split up like this, well, first of all, these are the events for when you press WASD for going north, west, south, and east, or up, down, left, right on the keyboard so far. I'm also going to make it a gamepad event eventually, but then here I set up a function. The function is called choose next cell. It takes self as an argument and also a direction. And here's an instance where reusing an enumeration that I set up before was actually really useful, because it just establishes, hey, I want to pick one. I don't have to pass in an object, I just pick one, because within here, it takes that enumeration, I switch on it, and then I just set what the current arrow helper is according to that. And here's where they come in. I use these arrow helpers so that when I need to get the world location, they're at the world location I need them to be. And then also the rotation, the direction that they're pointing, is expected to point to the next cell that is intended to go to. So if you press north, it'll set the north helper to this variable, and then we'll get the north rotation so that it's pointing at most likely the next cell north of your location. We also get its forward vector from that rotation, and then we extend it by 1500 or 1000. Yeah, 1500. We add the world location to put it in the right position, and then we do another line trace by channel. This time I set up the draw debug type to persistent, and I'm guessing you can flag this based on environment so you don't have to show it on the actual build. Upgrade that generic actor to a map cell actor, and I set it as the chosen cell. And that's all this function does. It just chooses the next cell. So it makes a raycast in the direction you want, and then returns that object and stores it. Next we go back up here, and what we're going to do is use a new node that I have not used before. So what I've done here is I've defined a curve, and I've called it alpha because that's the output it's going to produce. It's going to produce a value of alpha between 0 and 1, and over how, what amount of time, right? So when it plays, it's just going to constantly output a value from 0 to 1. And these all do the same thing. There might be a way to sync these together as well to make it a little bit more compact, but for now, you play from start so that it always starts over whenever this is called. And then we call update pawn location, which takes the alpha. And then from here, we look at the scene root, which is this whole component, the player pawn component. We get its location vector, and then we get the chosen cell vector, and we add -230 on the x-axis to keep it, hovered above like we expect it to be. And we also get the tile actor inside of it. That's this middle thing right here. So we throw that in here, and based on the current alpha, we'll get a value between vector A and vector B. We throw that into new location for a set world location, and the default scene root, since everything's nested under it, will just move the player accordingly. And to see that in action, here we go. We go right. As you can see, the red line projected to the next cell. It got information about that cell's location and then interpolated between that and the next cell. And since I've got that working for every location, we can go all the way across the map. Now if I do it too fast, it kind of hops around, but if I wait, it'll actually do it properly. And then once I get the bindings set up for the diagonals, I'll see if that works. And as you can see, as you go around, you can kind of tell that my vectors are way too long, but I think it's fine. But this is the bit of success I was looking for. I'm moving around a map. And I'd like to emphasize how nice this is, because now I don't have to have a state that manages where you are necessarily or has to care about the cells, because the pawn will always reach out to the next cell it needs to go to, and it can always look into the cell it's currently at for information on where it can go. So in a future devlog, I'm sure I'm going to set up logic for, hey, if there's no connection to the next cell, you can't go in that direction, and that is just going to be a nice feature to implement, because I don't have to have reference to every other cell within a cell, which also likely reduces the amount of memory and CPU usage that you're going to be using at runtime. So very, very cool feature that I've learned. I'm sure a lot of veteran game devs know about this, but I was just super excited to see that. Anything else? Line tracing, animation, UMG, and yeah, I guess I would also like to point out that this design is meant to be something that I can maintain without having to be a modeler or an animator, skeletal animator or anything like that. So that's where I'm going with this, and I'm having a lot of fun. So thanks for watching.